Nice to see you all. We were invited, Jessica was invited to give a talk here about in the brain area of the interdisciplinary week. And Jessica has become involved in the problems of understanding language in speech. That's what she's doing here as a postdoc. She's funded by Google at the moment on a project which specifically engages in questions about how sound is coded in our brain. But it is generally the question in our group, how we can make speech better understandable for people with a hearing impairment, or, well, trying to apply this knowledge also to normal listening people. I'll just get over to Jessica.
Right, so I'm going to talk about your brain at the cocktail party. So this is the kind of situation we're thinking about, particularly. So you've got a number of people in the room, and then you're trying to listen to someone speak while there's all of this background noise and different voices going on. So actually, for normal hearing people, generally this isn't too much of a problem. So even as we increase the level of the noise relative to the speech and look at the speech recognition scores, even in this region here, where the noise is louder than the speech, we still get good speech understanding until the noise is quite loud. However, for hearing impaired people, noise is far more harmful to their speech understanding, and far before the noise is louder than the speech, they're really suffering. And this is true even if they're using their hearing aids. It can be even more of a problem for automatic speech recognition. So if you're dictating something to a computer and there's any kind of background noise at all, then quite quickly you lose any ability for it to recognize the speech. And as a demonstration of that, this is Vista's speech recognition software being presented at a press conference. So there's a bit of reverberation and background noise, and it doesn't like it very much.
Dear Mom, comma. Fix ant. Delete that. Delete that. Delete that. I think it's picking up a little bit of echo here. Delete, select all. Okay. I'm glad you're enjoying.
So it's not a very easy task for a computer, but why are humans so good at separating sounds? So in general, this isn't really a problem that we think much about, because generally we do it effortlessly in most situations. But actually it's really quite difficult. If you think about it, when you have different sources in a room, when they reach your ear, they all mix together in your ear canal, and they all just combine to form a one-dimensional vibration of the eardrum. So if we have a speech signal coming in,
good news, everyone,
and then add some music to that, and then maybe some road noises as well, the mixture, it's quite difficult to see how you'd be able to separate the different sounds out of this mess arriving at your eardrum. But actually when you listen to it,
good news, everyone,
you're probably, even if you weren't able to understand the speech as well, you're probably able to still recognize there were three different sources and to hear them individually. So why are we so good at this? Well, we haven't just evolved this for important cocktail parties or even just for aiding speech understanding. So this is more the kind of scenario we should be thinking about. So here are some jungle sounds. So I don't know if you heard the jaguar roar in there, but that's the kind of important sounds that you should be listening out for. And the kind of evolutionary pressure that has caused us to be able to separate sounds so well. So basically the ears have evolved in order to direct our attention to sources of interest. So how does it work? Well, first I'm going to talk about the auditory periphery here. So here's the outer ear, which you'll probably recognize. And then the sound comes in to the ear canal and causes vibrations the pressure waves causes vibrations of the tympanic membrane or eardrum, and those vibrations are then passed through the bones in the inner ear, the ossicles, and then cause a vibrator membrane at the end of this organ here called the cochlea, which is full of fluid. So here again is the cochlea, and we can unwind it, and it's this fluid-filled tube with a membrane in the middle, and this is the basilar membrane. So the vibrations pass through and cause pressure waves in the fluid, which then and sound waves then vibrate the basilar membrane, and the basilar membrane actually assists in separating sounds into different frequencies because it's thicker at the apical end than at the basal end, and so this means that sounds that have lower frequencies cause maximum vibration at the apical end, and sounds with higher frequencies cause vibration at the more basal end of the cochlea. So we can look at a cross-section through the cochlea here. So here's the basilar membrane again, and then here are the inner hair cells. And what happens when the basilar membrane moves is it squishes the stereocilia of the inner hair cells against this tectoral membrane, and this causes transduction of the mechanical energy from the basilar membrane into electrical energy, which travels along the auditory nerve to the brain. So the role of the cochlea is to give us some kind of information about the different frequencies in sound. It splits it into different frequencies. So this is rather like a spectrogram, where we have the frequency of this speech here and time across here. So high intensities are in red and lower intensity sounds are in blue. And if we sum across this, we just get our initial
Good
wave.
news, everyone!
So we're able to see the different frequencies in speech, and it kind of gives us a bit of a better representation than just considering the waveform. But again, if we consider that mixture of sounds,
Good news, everyone!
it's still hard to see from the spectrogram which bits of energy would belong to which of the sources. So we've split it into frequency, but we still haven't separated it into different sources. So what do we need for that? Well, we also need to think about the auditory brain, which does this segregation of the different sources. So there are lots of different cues that the brain can use in order to separate different sounds. So in particular for different voices, we use pitch differences to separate out different speakers. So if we consider listening to two men standing in roughly the same location with the same voice pitch, then the mixture of their voices will sound something like this.
The children like strawberries.
So you may have picked out a few words, but you probably weren't able to determine which belonged to which sentence. But if we consider instead that there's a woman standing here, so they've got different voice pitches, and listen again, if you now try listening to the male speaker,
The thin dog was strawberries.
anyone get it? Try again. Yeah.
The thin dog was strawberries.
So it's very good. So that's one way we can segregate different speakers. This also works in music. So let's turn it up for this. So these are two different melodies. So there's going to be a distracting melody and the melody that you should be able to recognise once the difference in pitch is large enough. So put your hand up when you recognise the melody. And finally, so that was Mary Had a Little Lamb.
Is it just getting louder, or is
No, the pitch difference between the distracting melody and the other one is getting more. So another thing we can use to separate different speakers for human speech is size differences. So this, so as well as speakers having different voice pitches, they also have different vocal tract lengths. So the vocal tract length is the length between the larynx to the lips, and that is generally proportional to your height. So men have much longer vocal tracts than women, and you can actually hear those differences in speech. It affects the resonance of different sounds, and you can use that to separate different speakers. So now again, if we have two men at the same location, same voice pitch and same vocal tract length, then the mixture sounds like this.
The cloud with a knife face.
I'll probably take that. So that's a bit hard to understand, but if we make one of the men quite a lot shorter, and now you try to listen out for what the shorter man says.
The cloud with a knife face.
Anyone get it? Yeah.
The cloud with a knife face.
So that's another way we can separate different speakers. So finally, a cue that's particularly useful at cocktail parties. So generally people aren't all huddled in one location, but they're spread out around you. And then you can make use of various cues provided by your binaural system by combining the information from your two ears to actually separate out different speakers. So I'm just going to, I can't really demonstrate those very easily, but I'm just going to describe a bit about how your brain locates sounds. So sound localization in the horizontal plane, we use two main cues. So if I have a sound coming from the right, it will arrive at my right ear first and my left ear shortly afterwards, just because the path is longer. And that slight difference in the arrival times of the sounds can be detected by the brain with differences as small as a few millionths of a second. So that's one cue we can use to determine the direction, because that will change as we vary the location of the sound. Secondly, a sound arriving at the left ear will have had to pass through the head and around, and so it will be attenuated in level compared to the right ear, where the sound just goes directly to it. So then we can also use this difference in level to determine where the sound was coming from. So here's one way animals make use of these spatial cues. So here's a fox who's hunting for mice under the snow. So you can't see them, and he can only use his directional hearing cues to locate the mice.
It listens for the tiny sounds of its prey moving about below, but must take great care not to scare them away.
That's amazing. Segregation. So one other thing that our binaural system helps us with is dealing with reverberation. So in rooms, so this is another problem that we're probably not really aware of the difficulty of. So when you hear me speak, there's not only the direct sound travelling from my mouth to your ears, but there's also even more energy reflecting off the walls and tables and floors and so on. And so you might think that this would distract you from the quieter sound coming directly from my mouth, but in fact what you still hear is basically one source coming from my location. And this is because the reflections arrive slightly later than the direct sound, and the brain is able to suppress the later arriving sounds. That's the precedence effect. So this is particularly useful in a cocktail party, because otherwise you'd be distracted by all the various reflections around, as well as all the different talkers. So just to summarise this bit, sound segregation by the auditory brain is aided by cues such as differences in voice pitch, differences in speaker size, and also various spatial cues, and also by the suppression of reflections. So, where do problems arise with this? Well, with the automatic speech recognition system, its problem is really that it's missing this auditory brain. So, automatic speech recognition systems have some form of pre-processing, so it will separate the sound into different frequencies in a similar way to the cochlea. But even so, it's missing the auditory brain, so it's not able to segregate when there are different sounds present, so it's not able to determine what's noise and what's speech, for example. We have basically the converse problem when we have hearing impairment. So here we've possibly got a completely functional auditory brain, and if there was enough information reaching it, then it would be able to separate sounds into different sources. But in fact, the auditory periphery is impaired in some way, so that not enough information is actually reaching the auditory brain for us to solve these problems. So one example of a hearing impairment is with cochlear implant users. So people get cochlear implants when they're profoundly hearing impaired, so when they can't really make any use of sound signals. And what that involves is implanting an electrode array in the cochlea, because the hair cells are no longer functioning to be able to transduce the motion of the basilar membrane into the electrical impulses. So instead, we directly stimulate the auditory nerve by using an array of electrodes implanted in the cochlea. So I'll talk more about the processing in a bit. And here's this just shows the electrodes around the auditory nerve. So this is a schematic of the processing that goes on a cochlear implant from the initial auditory audiosys input and going on to the electrodes. So first of all, we just have a normal speech waveform input, and then this is filtered into different frequency channels in a similar way to how the cochlea would do it, but now we've got far fewer channels. So compared to the 30,000 or so auditory nerve cells, we instead just have maybe as many as 20 channels, but it's still far more sparse than our initial, our ideal input. And then we further degrade the signal by extracting, rather than just keeping this fine temporal structure in each frequency band, we just use the overall slowly varying energy of each band, the envelope. And the reason we do this is when the auditory nerve is stimulated in this way, it's not able to follow rapid fluctuations of the type you get in the input waveform. And then this envelope of the energy is used to modulate a train of electrical pulses. So the shape of these pulses gives the information about the incoming speech envelope. And each one of these trains of electrical impulses is sent to one of the electrodes implanted in the cochlea. So we have two kinds of reductions in information here. So firstly, we've got far less fine-grained frequency information. We've got far fewer channels. And also we've reduced the temporal information by just having the slowly varying envelope. And I'll show you how that affects your perception of sounds. So I'm going to play you some music which has been, we put through a simulation of a cochlear implant. And I'm going to gradually increase the number of channels, and you can indicate when you recognise the music. This is more channels. One more. So that was actually Rhapsody of Luke. Right. So basically, the kind of rapid changes in frequency and amplitude that you get in music are particularly badly dealt with by the cochlear implant processor. But I've got another piece, and this might be a bit easier because it also includes some vocals. So see whether you can guess what this next one is. No? So that was Johnny Cash from Ring of Fire, but some of you are definitely getting that with just 6 channels of information. So basically, speech is far easier to understand than music, and that's both because cochlear implants are sort of aimed at encoding speech, so that's their target rather than music in general, but also that the brain it also specialises in speech to some extent, so it's able to understand speech even when it's really quite degraded. So, what can we use to overcome these 2 problems that we have with automatic speech recognition and also with hearing impairment? Well, the ability of the normal auditory system to solve these problems suggests to us we should be using a bio-inspired processing approach. So that's both trying to simulate the auditory periphery and then also simulating the auditory brain. So first of all, the auditory periphery. So if we take an input waveform like this, and we got its spectrogram, so we know all its different frequency components, and we can simulate the action of the cochlea on this waveform by just filtering the sound. And so we filter it into 22 frequency channels, which again is much less than we get in the normal auditory system. And then what we do further is in the lower frequency channels, so we keep all of this fine structured temporal information that we get from the filtered signal, but above 1200 hertz, then we just take the envelope in a similar way to what we did with the cochlear implant processing. And this is just simulating the fact that the auditory nerve is unable to follow very high frequency sounds. So it just generally follows the envelope of the sound. So we can more or less straightforwardly approximate the auditory periphery. But now the auditory brain is the really difficult bit. So it's we can't really simulate the kind of processes that I showed you earlier, such as separating pitch by voice pitch, mainly because, well, both because the mechanisms aren't fully understood, but also because as you may have noticed when you were listening to the simultaneous sentences, you basically have to direct your attention to one sentence or another. So an automatic process that's segregated the speech would have to select for you what sound was going to be enhanced and what was going to be suppressed. And if it made the wrong choice, then it's actually going to make the situation worse and suppress what you were trying to listen to. So we're going to look at a slightly easier problem, and that's listening to speech and noise. So at least in this situation, we can assume that you want to listen to the speech rather than to the noise. So first, I'm going to talk a bit about how the brain represents speech sounds. So this is now your brain in a quiet room listening to some speech. And if we just consider a small segment of that speech, then journeying into the midbrain, there are many millions of neurons there, and each one of them, so I've represented these neurons here, and each one of them has its own kind of favourite feature of speech that it will respond to. So certain components and modulations, so I've represented that inside each of these neurons. So when it feels that it detects that that modulation is present in the incoming speech sound, then it will fire in response to the sound. And all of the rest of them will continue going as they were. So here's our incoming speech sound, and when it reaches the midbrain, then a handful of these neurons will fire in response because they detect their favoured features in the speech, but the rest of them won't. And this is the sparse bit of this representation, the fact that out of all of the, your perception of the sound will come just from the firing of the neurons in response. And what we can do is, if we assume that we know what each of the neurons' favourite feature is, then when we see these three firing, we can then try to reconstruct the incoming signal by adding together their favourite features. So like this, and what we end up with is quite a good approximation to the original signal. And so computationally, we try to simulate this by taking an example of speech, so say 30 seconds of clean speech, and then we use an algorithm to learn say 1,000 rather than 1,000,000 of these kind of typical speech components. And then when we've got this database of the components, we can then represent speech sounds in a sparse way by just using a few components. So just to show you that, so then having got our database of components, we can then try and represent different examples of clean speech segments, and we find that the majority of them can be represented by just a few of these components. However, if we try to do the same with white noise, then we find that we need many hundreds of components, and this is because the noise is random, so it can't really be it can't be more efficiently coded than that because it's completely unpredictable, whereas speech has well-defined features which are similar across different speech, and we can use these typical components in that case. And this is beneficial for us when we want to try and separate speech and noise, because if we have a mixture and we want to accurately represent the speech, we want to just approximate that mixture with just a few components, we'll tend to accurately represent the speech, which just needs a few components, but we won't represent the noise very well because that needs very many components. So now considering the brain at the cocktail party, so as well as this clean speech, we've also got some background noise. So then here's our noisy speech waveform, and what we do is look for an approximation to this noisy signal to a certain degree of accuracy, but making it up of only of the components from our database. And we want to use as few components as possible to try and separate out the speech and the noise. And so what we end up with is something like this, which when we go and look at the clean signal is quite a good approximation. So there's still a bit of noise left in some places, but most of the noise has been removed. and I could just demonstrate that to you. So here's our example sentence of clean speech, and when we add some white noise to that, it sounds like this.
Sticks were under the tree, the little babies sleep, while watching the train, the school's finished early, the glass bowl broke.
And then when we denoise it by trying to make up the approximation with as few components as possible, then this is what our approximation sounds like.
Sticks were under the tree, the little babies sleep, while watching the train, the school's finished early, the glass bowl broke.
So there are certain distortions where it's tried to fit the speech-like components to the noise, but in general, most of the noise has been got rid of, and we can compare that to the clean speech.
Sticks were under the tree, the little baby sleeps, they're watching the train, the school finished early, the glass bowl broke.
So, just to summarise, cocktail party listening requires a brain. And what the brain helps us to do is by detecting voice pitch or features such as size of speaker or location, it helps us to segregate the different speakers from one another and also from the background noise. But automatic speech recognition can't separate speech from noise effectively at the moment. And so what we hope is that automatic speech recognition and also hearing devices might be improved by applying this kind of sparse representation of speech that we see in the brain and using that to denoise the speech. So, thanks to Google, who are funding us, and to Stephen Blake, Matthew Wright and Ian Winter, who I'm working with, and also to John Culling, who helped with some of the slides. And thanks to you for listening.
Thank you.